Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so we've got this really interesting stack in front of us today. All your notes, articles, bits of research.
Yeah, quite a pile.
It is. And our mission basically is to really dig into subcultural theory of crime and deviance. We want to, figure out what it's actually saying, look at the key ideas, the examples from these sources.
And boil it down to what really matters for you, the listener.
Exactly what you need to know. And the core idea, I think, is, well, it's fascinating right off the bat. It really challenges that simple view that crime is just, bad people making bad choices.
Right.
This theory says, wait a minute, our environment, the groups we're part of, they play a huge role, maybe even a surprising one.
That's the heart of it, yeah. Subcultural theory basically argues crime isn't always just about, personal issues or someone coldly deciding to break the law. A lot of it, it suggests, comes from norms within certain groups.
Subcultures.
Exactly, subcultures, where the norms themselves actually make it okay or even encourage behaviors that mainstream society calls criminal.
And it connects to things we touched on before, right? Like social disorganization, strain theory. There are overlaps.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. No society is just one single culture. You've got the dominant mainstream one, sure. But then there are loads of smaller groups, subcultures. Many just coexist, different hobbies, different communities.
But some are different. They consciously sort of push against the mainstream.
Precisely. And those contrasting subcultures, according to the theory, can develop their own values, their own rules that are pretty different. And sometimes those rules might actually promote or, normalize behavior the mainstream sees as deviant or criminal.
Which helps explain why people in those groups might act that way.
It gives a social explanation, yeah.
Where did this idea even start? The sources mentioned it really taking off back in the, 1920s.
It did, yeah. That was a time of huge upheaval. Cities like Chicago were booming, industrializing.
Lots of immigration, diverse.
Exactly. And the old established ways felt kind of challenged by all these new groups with different lifestyles. So sociologists were trying to figure out, how do these group dynamics in these changing cities relate to things like crime? Subcultural theory was one way they tried to make sense of it.
The source uses the example of the 1960s hippie counterculture, which is interesting because we don't usually think criminal there now, but it illustrates the point, right?
That's a good way to put it. It wasn't about, theft or violence necessarily, but they clearly had norms around drugs, social structures that were radically different, deviant from the mainstream view back then.
So it shows how a group can have its own rules that clash.
Right. And what's key for crime theory is how some subcultures don't just tolerate deviance. They might actually weave it into their value system. It becomes part of how you get respect or status within that group.
Okay, let's make this more concrete. To really get how these different norms work, we should look at some of the researchers the source mentions, the ones who actually went out and observed this stuff.
Absolutely.
Right.
And probably one of the most powerful examples is Elijah Anderson's work, his study on the code of the streets.
Where was this?
He did this really intensive field work, qualitative stuff. In the mid-90s, spent a lot of time in inner-city African-American communities in Philadelphia, observing, talking to people, really trying to understand the unwritten rules.
But what he found was pretty stark.
It really was. He
Wow.
argued that for a lot of people there, especially young men who felt kind of cut off from mainstream society, from jobs, from respect, this alternative system of values had emerged, the code of the streets.
And the source really emphasizes this. The absolute core of that code is respect.
Yes. Respect is everything. It's the main currency. And crucially, you have to get it and defend it by any means necessary. That's the phrase.
Which includes aggression, violence.
It can, yeah. Intimidation, being ready to fight, sometimes actual crime. It's about showing you can't be messed with.
So violence isn't random. It's almost a tool in this context.
It functions that way, yes. Anderson described how kids learn it really young. If someone disrespects you, the code says you have to respond, often physically. It gets reinforced all the time in how people talk. You gotta pay them back, straighten them out.
It's like the expected behavior.
And in that specific environment, yes, it becomes a way to gain standing, to survive.
There was also that really important nuance Anderson found, wasn't there, about different types of families.
Yes, that's critical. He talked about decent families, people who strongly believed in mainstream values like hard work, school, church. But even they sometimes felt they had to adopt parts of the code.
Why?
For protection, maybe? Or just so their kids wouldn't be seen as easy targets. It shows just how powerful those street norms could be, influencing everyone, even those who didn't fully buy into them.
That really sheds light on why someone, especially a young guy, might get drawn into this kind of subculture.
Exactly. The theory suggests it's often because they feel like they don't have status or opportunities in the mainstream world. The source gives that Joe example. If you grow up somewhere with few good jobs, not much chance for wealth.
You feel like you're losing by mainstream standards.
Right. So, joining a gang or adopting the code offers another way, a different game with different rules.
Where you can get status.
Precisely. Status comes from toughness, loyalty, maybe breaking those mainstream rules that didn't seem to work for you anyway. You find belonging, respect, but through a different, often oppositional value system.
Which sounds a lot like what Albert Cohn was talking about with delinquent subcultures.
Yeah, Cohen really focused on that idea of rejection. He said these gang subcultures don't just happen to be different. They often actively, deliberately reject mainstream values and rules.
It ties into strain theory again, that feeling of being blocked.
They might reject the goals, like the American dream, and the proper ways to get there.
He had that great Ferrari example in the source material.
Yes, that really makes it clear. So, in mainstream culture, maybe you buy a Ferrari to show off your success, your wealth, earned legitimately. You park it somewhere fancy.
Right.
But Cohen suggested in a delinquent subculture, you might gain status by breaking into that Ferrari, joyriding it, maybe stripping it for parts. The act itself, the rejection of the mainstream symbol and rules, is what earns respect from your peers in the subculture. It flips the meaning entirely.
Wow, yeah, that's a powerful image. Okay, then there's Walter Miller. He had a different angle, focusing on focal concerns.
Right. Miller studied gang cultures too, and he argued that joining these groups leads to a shift in what people really care about, their main preoccupations, their focal concerns. They move away from mainstream goals towards the stuff valued within the game.
And the source lists 6 of them, things that are common in these groups and often lead towards crime.
Exactly. These are like the guiding principles.
Yeah.
So first, there's trouble, which is interesting because it's not just avoiding trouble, but sometimes getting into it. Showing you can handle conflict, defy authority, but still get away with it earns respect.
Okay, then toughness. That seems straightforward.
Yeah, physical strength, fighting ability, it's often tied up with hypermasculinity, showing you can protect yourself and aren't scared.
Third was smartness, but not like book smarts.
No, definitely
Yes.
not. It's street smarts,
Yeah.
practical know-how, being able to, fix things, figure situations out, and especially being cunning enough to outwit authority, like the cops.
Got it. Number 4, excitement.
This one values thrills, taking risks, living on the edge. Sometimes crime itself, like shoplifting or even more serious stuff, provides that excitement and proves your daring.
Fate. That one's a bit different.
It is. It's the sense that your life is kind of determined by forces you can't control, luck, the system, whatever. It can sort of take the pressure off, If things are fated, maybe you're less responsible for not achieving mainstream success or for taking risks.
And the last one, autonomy.
Basically, a really strong dislike of being controlled or told what to do, especially by outside authorities. It's about wanting to be your own boss, operate without interference from police or laws. Miller said these 6 things together really shape the mindset in these subcultures.
Making crime seem less like a deviation and more like a natural outcome of those concerns.
In some ways, yeah. Okay, so building on all this, you then get Cloward and Olin in the 60s with their differential opportunity theory.
Differential opportunity. So it's about the chances you have.
Exactly. Their big idea was opportunity structures everything. If you have access to legitimate ways to succeed, good schools, good jobs, you're more likely to stick with mainstream culture.
Makes sense. And if you don't have those legitimate opportunities,
Then you're much more likely to turn to or develop criminal subcultures, because those subcultures offer different goals and, crucially, different ways to achieve them, ways that might actually be available to you, even if they're illegal.
okay. And they saw different types of these subcultures developing, depending on the neighborhood.
Right. They identified 3 main types in poorer areas. First, the criminal subculture. This pops up where the slum is relatively organized in a criminal sense. Meaning there are existing criminal networks, maybe older criminals who act as mentors. Crime is learned. It's often focused on making money theft, rackets, that kind of thing. There's a structure to it.
Okay, organized crime, basically. What's the second type?
That's the conflict subculture. This happens in more disorganized, unstable areas. You still have few legitimate opportunities, but you also lack those organized criminal mentors.
So crime isn't about making money in the same way.
Not primarily, because there isn't that structure. Instead, Cloward and Olin said, deviance becomes about gaining respect through toughness, through fighting, through controlling turf. Violence and conflict are the main ways to get status.
And the third one they mentioned.
The retreatist subculture. They called these the double failure.
Several failures.
Yeah, people who couldn't make it work through legitimate means or through the illegitimate means available in the criminal or conflict subcultures. They couldn't succeed as a student or worker, nor as a successful thief or tough guy.
So what do?
They basically check out. They retreat, often into heavy drug or alcohol use, as a way to escape the pressures and failures of both worlds.
Okay. Wow. So we've laid out the core ideas, the history, Anderson, Cohen, Miller, Cloward, and Olin. A lot there. Stepping back, how does this theory stack up? Logically, does it make sense?
Well, logically, its big strength is how it emphasizes socialization. It really shows how group influences shape us, right? It's a strong argument against purely individual explanations for crime, free will, rational choice alone.
It helps explain why some groups seem to have higher crime rates.
Exactly. It suggests it might be because the group's norms are different, maybe even conducive to crime. It gives us a framework for understanding, say, youth gangs.
Are there downsides? Criticisms?
Yeah, definitely. One common one is that it can maybe overgeneralize a bit. It might sound like everyone in a subculture thinks and acts exactly the same.
Which isn't realistic.
Right. It can downplay individual agency, people's ability to choose not to follow the group, even when the pressure's strong. Like we said, not everyone exposed to the code becomes a criminal.
And the source mentioned another criticism about potentially criminalizing lifestyles.
Yes, that's a really important point, often raised by critical theorists. There's a risk, they argue, that the theory gets used to label entire groups, especially non-dominant cultures like certain racialized or poor communities, as inherently criminal or deviant.
Just because their values are different from the mainstream.
Precisely. The worry is that this association might reflect the biases of the observers more than an actual causal link between those specific cultural values and crime. And that can lead to things like stereotyping and over-policing. We need to be careful just to report that this criticism exists in the source material, not endorse it ourselves.
Okay, so that's a critical perspective to keep in mind. What about evidence? Does research actually back up the theory?
It does, yeah. Anderson's study is probably the prime example. His fieldwork provided really rich data showing, yes, these communities existed where certain types of crime and violence were normalized, even required in certain situations to maintain respect.
And you showed how people felt drawn to it.
Right, how it appealed to those feeling alienated, and how values like honor could directly lead to violence or justify things like mugging. And that point about the decent families having to adapt, that's strong evidence for the power of the subcultural environment.
So finally, how useful is this theory? What do we do with it?
Well, that's tricky. A really simplistic take might be, okay, let's just stamp out these subcultures, make everyone follow mainstream rules.
Which sounds not great and probably impossible.
Exactly, and problematic. Who gets to decide which culture is right? As the source notes, judging another culture is always biased by your own background. It can lead straight back to those problems of misunderstanding, stereotyping, maybe targeting certain groups unfairly.
So how is it used now, more constructively?
Often, the focus shifts away from criticizing the culture itself. Instead, contemporary approaches use the theory to say, okay, why did this subculture emerge? Usually it points back to those root issues.
Like a lack of opportunity.
Poverty.
Exactly. So the utility becomes about tackling those things, addressing poverty, improving education, creating real job pathways. The thinking is, if you give people viable ways to succeed within the mainstream, they'll be less likely to need or want the status offered by a deviant subculture. That makes sense, like addressing the cause, not just the symptom.
Right. And on a smaller scale, at the micro level, it supports things like outreach programs. Programs that offer young people alternatives, different role models, education, job training, just ways to connect with different norms and opportunities, and get some distance from subcultures focused on crime.
Okay, so let's bring this home for you, the listener.
Right.
Why should you care about subcultural theory? What's the takeaway?
I think it's really important because it pushes us beyond those simple individual explanations for crime. It makes us think about the power of the social world, the group, the environment.
Gives context.
Yeah, context and complexity. It helps us understand why people might act in ways that seem totally foreign or irrational from our own perspective. It's about seeing the different rule books people might be playing by.
So to wrap up, we've explored subcultural theory, how it suggests group norms can lead to crime. We looked at its origins, key thinkers like Anderson and the Code of the Streets, Cohen's idea of rejecting mainstream values,
Hmm.
Miller's focal concerns.
And Cloward and Allen's theory about how opportunity shapes the type of subculture, criminal, conflict, or retreatist.
We also touched on the strengths, like explaining group behavior, but also the criticisms, like overgeneralizing or the risk of criminalizing cultures.
And how its usefulness today often lies in tackling root causes like poverty and lack of opportunity.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to chew on. Building on this idea of cultural influence,
Mm.
how much are our own lives, our choices, our ideas of what's normal shaped by the subcultures we're in? Maybe our work culture, our social circles, our online communities.
Yeah, things we don't even think of as subcultures, but that definitely have their own unwritten rules and expectations. How aware are we of those? How much do they guide us without us even noticing?
Or perhaps, how do we navigate that tension between understanding group influence and holding individuals accountable for their actions? It's complex.
It definitely is.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.